Imagine turning on your television on the second Saturday in December. You sit
Hmm.
down on the couch, expecting to flip between a dozen different college football games.
Right.
But your screen is just surprisingly empty. Almost every major sports network is showing alternative programming. And why? Because the President of the United States issued a legally binding document ordering the federal government to clear the national airwaves, so literally nothing competes with the broadcast of the Army-Navy game.
Right, which sounds completely made up. I mean, it sounds like a hypothetical scenario from a constitutional law class. The idea of the executive branch commanding private broadcast networks, we're talking ESPN, Fox, CBS, to alter their sports schedules just to protect the single culturally significant football game is, well, it's staggering when you think about the actual legal mechanics involved. Yeah, staggering is the word. And yet that is a real directive sitting in this massive stack of official executive branch documents that we are unpacking today. We have just a mountain of paper in front of us. Executive orders, official fact sheets, press releases, all dated around mid-March 2026. And the scope here is wild. Some of these documents dictate the future of global artificial intelligence and nuclear energy, while others are, like we just said, intensely focused on what you are allowed to watch on a Saturday afternoon.
Exactly. And our goal for this deep dive is to really look past the official presidential seals and those bold press release headlines to understand the actual physical mechanics of these documents. We want to understand what happens when the ink dries, like which of these directives genuinely alter the daily lives of regular Americans, which ones are designed to quietly shift massive financial benefits to large corporations. And perhaps most importantly, we need to examine how the language of executive power itself is fundamentally changing. Now, I do want to make something explicitly clear before we get into the weeds here. We're looking at sources today that are completely saturated with highly charged political rhetoric. I mean, these documents deal with immigration, border security, the social safety net, and incredibly intense partisan disputes.
Yeah.
So we are not taking any political sides today.
Right, yeah, absolutely not.
We are endorsing the claims or the viewpoints or the rhetoric contained in these pages. Think of us as mechanics looking at an engine. We are just here to show you how the gears turn, how the belts connect, and what the machine is designed to do. We are evaluating the engineering, not voting for the driver.
That is the perfect framework. And to understand how this particular engine runs, it really makes sense to start with the gears that connect most directly to the average person's wallet. The documents concerning housing, construction, and mortgages, they offer a absolute masterclass in the tension between what a policy says it will do and who actually benefits the very moment it goes into effect.
Yeah, let's open up the Promoting Access to Mortgage Credit Executive Order. Because the headline goal here is something almost everyone agrees on, right? Making it easier and more affordable to buy a home. The text instructs federal agencies to tailor their rules to help, quote-unquote, smaller banks facilitate more lending. Now, when I read smaller banks, my mind immediately goes to the local credit union downtown. The place with 3 tellers and free coffee in the lobby. But then I looked at how the order actually defines a smaller bank.
Yeah, that definition is key. The text defines it as any bank with assets fewer than $100 billion.
Wait, $100 billion?
Yes.
That is not a community bank. I mean, Silicon Valley Bank had roughly double that when it collapsed and caused a literal national panic. $100 billion institution is a massive regional powerhouse. They have thousands of employees.
Right, it is a substantial corporate entity. And by defining these massive regional banks as smaller, the order immediately broadens the scope of who gets relief from federal regulations. And the specific regulations they are targeting here are incredibly significant. The order explicitly directs the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to ease up on 2 specific frameworks: the ability to repay rule and the qualified mortgage rule.
Okay, I want to pause there.
Sure.
Because the text argues that we need to evaluate lenders based on effectiveness rather than technical compliance and reverse a decade of regulatory distortion. And I know those rules were born out of the 2008 financial crisis, but how do they actually work in practice? Like if you or I walk into a bank today for a mortgage, what is the ability to repay rule actually doing behind the scenes?
To understand the rule, you really have to remember what caused the 2008 crash. Leading up to that crisis, banks were aggressively issuing subprime mortgages, and they were offering loans with these toxic features like negative amortization.
Yeah. Okay, that's a term you hear thrown around a lot in finance documentaries, but what does negative amortization physically mean for the person sitting at the kitchen table writing the check every month?
It means your monthly mortgage payment is set so low that it doesn't even cover the interest you owe for that month. So you make your payment, but the total amount you owe the bank actually goes up.
Wow.
Yeah, your debt grows while you are actively paying it. Banks were also offering balloon payments where you pay almost nothing for, say, 5 years, and then suddenly you owe a massive lump sum. And they were doing this without ever verifying if the borrower had the income, the assets, or the employment history to actually survive those massive future payments.
Like the banks didn't care.
Yeah.
Right. They were instantly selling those loans off to Wall Street.
Exactly. They offloaded the risk immediately. So the ability to repay rule was the legislative antidote to that specific behavior. It literally forces the lender, by law, to make a reasonable, good faith determination that you, the consumer, have the financial means to pay back the loan over its entire lifespan.
So they have to check your W-2s, your debt-to-income ratio, all of that.
Right. They have
Yeah.
to verify it. And the qualified mortgage rule is the companion to that. If a bank follows all those strict verification steps and avoids those toxic features like negative amortization, the loan is considered a qualified mortgage, which means the bank gets legal protection from lawsuits if the borrower eventually defaults.
Okay, so when this executive order directs agencies to ease these requirements, remove, quote, burdensome elements, and focus less on technical compliance, the stated intent is to free up capital, right? Let banks approve more loans faster, get more people into houses. But looking at the mechanics, the real-world effect is that we are lowering the standards required to prove a person can actually afford the house they are buying.
That is the mechanical reality. You are reducing the compliance costs for banks with up to $100 billion in assets, making it cheaper and easier for them to operate, while simultaneously reintroducing the systemic risk of giving people loans they might not be able to service long-term.
And the risk profile gets even stranger when you look at the second half of this order regarding appraisals, because the text tells regulators to expand the use of alternative valuation models, desktop and hybrid appraisals, and artificial intelligence valuation tools, while reducing traditional appraisal requirements for low-risk transactions. What exactly is a hybrid or desktop appraisal?
So traditionally, an appraiser is a licensed professional who physically walks through a home. They check the foundation, they see if the roof is caving in, they measure the square footage, and they compare it to recent sales in the neighborhood to determine the true value of the asset that's collateralizing the loan.
Right, a real human making sure the house isn't about to collapse.
Exactly. But a desktop appraisal means the appraiser never leaves their desk. They look at public tax records and old online listing photos to guess the value. A hybrid appraisal usually involves a third party, maybe a gig worker or a real estate agent driving by to snap a few photos of the exterior, and then an algorithm or a remote worker estimates the interior condition.
Throwing artificial intelligence into that mix feels like putting a Zillow's estimate on steroids and then using it to underwrite a 30-year financial contract. If we connect these two halves of the order, we are rolling back the strict safeguards that force a bank to prove I can repay my loan. And at the exact same time, we're encouraging banks to use algorithms and drive-by photos to guess what the house is actually worth without a human expert ever inspecting the basement for water damage.
Right.
I mean, a computer overvaluing an asset combined with a bank lending money to someone who can't afford it. How is that not just the exact recipe for a housing bubble, just rebranded as cutting red tape?
It's a profound shift in risk allocation. The immediate financial beneficiaries are the banks, who save millions in compliance and appraisal costs, and the companies developing these AI valuation tools. But the long-term systemic risk, that is shifted entirely onto the consumer who might buy an overvalued home with a loan they can't afford, and onto the broader economy if those loans begin to default at scale.
And this philosophy of deregulation to spur the market, it extends directly into the physical construction of the homes, too. There is a companion order in this stack called the Removing Regulatory Barriers to Affordable Home Construction Executive Order. It targets the builders. And the text cites this startling statistic, claiming that government regulations at all levels add an average of $90,000 to the price of a new single-family home.
Yeah, and the order aims to slash that $90,000 by directing the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers to fundamentally revise their requirements. It targets regulations around wetlands, stormwater management, and the Clean Water Act. It also takes direct aim at environmental reviews under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, demanding that agencies issue guidance that maximally exempts housing construction from these reviews.
So if I am a real estate developer looking to build a massive new subdivision of, say, 500 homes, this order is an absolute dream for me. I don't have to spend years and millions of dollars navigating complex federal reviews about how my concrete will affect the local watershed. My upfront costs just plummet. But what happens to the physical environment and the surrounding community when you maximally exempt developers from wetland protections?
Well, wetlands are essentially nature sponges. They absorb massive amounts of rainfall and slowly release it, which prevents sudden surges. When a developer paves over a wetland with concrete driveways and asphalt streets, and they aren't forced by the EPA to build expensive, sophisticated stormwater management systems, the rainwater has to go somewhere.
But the water doesn't just disappear because the regulation did.
Exactly. The physical mechanism of removing that regulation often results in increased downstream flooding. The water ends up in the streets and basements of the surrounding neighborhoods, or even in the newly constructed homes themselves.
And the order also explicitly calls out green building codes, claiming that green energy mandates alone can add $30,000 to the cost of a home. It offers federal incentives to state and local governments that adopt what it calls regulatory best practices, which the order defines as curtailing these green building codes and limiting the retroactive application of new safety codes.
This is a fascinating example of how costs are transferred rather than eliminated. A green building code typically mandates that a new home must be built with a certain level of thick insulation, highly efficient double-pane windows, and modern water conservation systems. Now, yes, those materials cost the builder more money up front, raising the initial sticker price of the house.
Right, but if a state takes the federal incentive and drops those codes, the builder uses cheaper, thinner insulation and single-pane windows. The buyer gets the house for slightly less money on closing day. But then for the next 30 years, that buyer bleeds money every single month on their heating and cooling bills because the house leaks air like a sieve.
Precisely. The cost wasn't eliminated by the stroke of a pen. It was converted from an upfront construction cost borne by the developer into a long-term utility tax borne by the homeowner. Furthermore, by using federal money to incentivize towns and cities to drop their safety and durability standards, the federal government risks triggering a race to the bottom.
Like local towns just competing to have the worst standards.
Yeah, localities will compete for federal grants by stripping away the exact codes that ensure homes can withstand extreme weather or aging.
It is remarkable how the language of the American dream, making it cheaper to build, easier to borrow, is utilized here to execute mechanical policy changes that heavily favor the profit margins of real estate developers and large regional banks. The government is essentially saying it trusts the private sector to manage its own risk. But when you look at how this administration handles programs where the government provides direct, taxpayer-funded support to regular citizens, that baseline assumption of trust vanishes entirely.
The contrast is stark. We move from the assumption that a $100 billion bank should be freed from technical compliance to the assumption that state-level social safety net programs are inherently fraudulent. Let's examine the establishing the task force to eliminate fraud executive order.
And to be fair to the text, combating fraud is a core, essential function of any functional government. The order cites a massive, very real example, the Feeding Our Future scandal in Minnesota. That was a $250 million fraud where a network of individuals set up shell companies and claimed to be feeding thousands of needy children during the pandemic, but were actually buying luxury real estate and cars with federal money. Rooting out that kind of systemic theft is incredibly important to protect taxpayer dollars.
Absolutely. The mechanics of fraud prevention are completely necessary. But the significance of this document lies in its unprecedented textual shift. Historically, an executive order is a deeply bureaucratic instruction manual. It dictates how agency heads should interpret statutes or disperse funds. The language is typically clinical.
Dry, boring legal text.
Yes, very dry. This document, however, reads like a highly aggressive partisan campaign speech printed on official White House letterhead.
I want to read some direct quotes from this legally binding administrative document so you can hear the tone. It claims that states have embraced loopholes and as a result, quote, illegal aliens, criminals, foreign gangs, bureaucrats, state and local officials, non-governmental organizations, and ineligible providers exploit these programs. It accuses self-dealing political actors of using public benefits to solidify control over their communities.
It really doesn't hold back.
It goes as far as claiming that public officials purposefully use lax immigration policies to admit migrants to rely on welfare in order to increase the political support and power of those officials. And it explicitly links this welfare reliance to widespread ballot harvesting schemes by non-citizens.
It is difficult to overstate how unusual it is to find accusations of systemic election theft, ballot harvesting, and intentional importation of migrants for political power codified within the text of an executive order. This blurs the line almost entirely between the administrative functioning of the executive branch and raw political campaigning.
Beyond the shock value of the vocabulary, we have to ask how this language affects the dignity of the millions of regular Americans who legally rely on these programs. We're talking about Medicaid for healthcare, SNAP for food assistance, child care subsidies. When the highest office in the country formally issues a document that broadly conflates immigrant populations and low-income citizens using the safety net with, quote, foreign gangs and criminals participating in election fraud, it fundamentally changes the narrative of poverty.
Right. It frames the act of utilizing a government benefit not as a citizen accessing a promised safety net during a difficult time, but as an inherently suspicious, potentially criminal act.
It stigmatizes the lawful beneficiary. But we also have to look at the structural goal of the task force itself. The vice president is appointed to chair this group, and the text instructs them to develop controls that operate before funds are obligated or dispersed. It mandates coordination among federal agencies to determine when to proactively pause certain types of funding.
So we need to look at how that actually works mechanically, because how does the federal government fund a state program like Medicaid or food stamps?
Right, they don't just mail a check to every person directly.
No. The federal government primarily funds these social safety nets through block grants or matched funding sent directly to the states. The state governments are the entities that actually administer the programs, they process the applications, verify the identities, and distribute the benefits to the citizens in their state. The federal government holds the purse strings, but the states operate the machinery.
So when this executive order says the task force will determine when to proactively pause funding, it is establishing a mechanism for the federal government to freeze the transfer of billions of dollars to a specific state if that state doesn't comply with the new, highly stringent verification measures demanded by the White House.
Yes. And the order even notes that 21 states, including massive economies like California and Illinois, are already suing the federal government to stop these new administrative reviews of their food stamp programs. So this sets the stage for a massive constitutional and structural showdown.
It's incredible. The executive branch is positioning itself to potentially choke off healthcare and food funding to millions of innocent people within specific states because of a political and administrative dispute over how eligibility is verified. The Constitution gives the power of the purse to Congress. They appropriate the money. But here, the executive branch is using agency disbursement rules as a blunt weapon against state governments that politically disagree with the administration.
It is a profound exertion of leverage. We see executive power being used to reshape the housing market by lifting regulations, and we see it being used to command the states by threatening to withhold funds. But the next document in our stack shows executive power expanding into a completely unexpected, culturally focused arena. We're moving from the structural to the symbolic.
Yeah, let's talk about the Preserving America's Game executive order, because when I read this one, I actually had to go back and check the date in the seal to make sure I wasn't reading a satirical article. The President of the United States is formally ordering the Secretary of Commerce and the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, to ensure that the college football playoffs do not broadcast a game that conflicts with the annual Army-Navy football game, which is played on the second Saturday in December.
It's wild. The text of the order states that scheduling conflicts detracts from a, quote, morale-building event of vital interest to the Department of War. It establishes an official executive policy that no college football game should be broadcast in a manner that directly conflicts with the Army-Navy game. And the mechanism of enforcement is fascinating. It tells the chairman of the FCC to consider reviewing the public interest obligations of broadcast licensees to force this exclusivity.
I really need to break this down because the implications are just wild. The FCC regulates the public airwaves. That's why they can fine a network if someone swears on live television during prime time, or why they allocate certain radio frequencies to emergency services. But ESPN, Fox Sports, CBS, these are private, multi-billion-dollar corporations paying astronomical sums for the exclusive rights to air college sports.
Right.
The idea that the federal government can step in and act as the ultimate TV guide programming director, dictating what time a private network is allowed to air a football game? I mean, how is that remotely legal?
Well, it touches on incredibly deep constitutional issues, primarily the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects the editorial control of broadcasts. A private network has the fundamental right to decide what content it airs and when it airs it, free from government coercion, provided it isn't broadcasting obscenity or direct incitements to violence.
And a scheduling conflict between two football games definitely doesn't meet any legal threshold for government intervention.
Exactly. So if this is almost certainly unconstitutional and represents a massive federal overreach into private commerce, you have to ask, why write it?
Right, what's the point of drafting an illegal order?
Because it is pure cultural signaling. It is using the formal, weighty apparatus of the presidency to appeal to patriotism, the military, and a very specific cultural nostalgia. It signals to a specific voter base that the administration prioritizes tradition and the armed forces over the commercial interests of corporate sports networks.
But the precedent it sets is what's truly alarming. If we accept the premise that the White House can use the FCC's licensing power to threaten private networks into clearing their schedule for a football game just because it's a, quote, morale-building event, what limits that power? What stops an administration from declaring that a specific political rally or a documentary favorable to the president is a national service event and demanding that all networks clear their Tuesday night schedule to air it?
Legally, very little, if the underlying premise of this order were to be upheld by the courts. It opens the door for the executive branch to weaponize regulatory agencies to manage cultural programming to align with its own interests.
And we see a similar strategy of using official orders for PR rather than strict policy in the ensuring truthful advertising of products claiming to be made in America executive order. On its face, the intent is fantastic. If you buy a cast iron skillet online that says made in the USA, you want the government to ensure it wasn't actually cast in a factory overseas and just slapped with a deceptive sticker by a third-party seller.
Consumer protection regarding country of origin labeling is a very standard area of federal regulation. It's usually handled by the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, but when you examine the specific vocabulary used in this executive order, the mandate just evaporates into thin air.
Yeah, the language is incredibly soft. It directs the FTC to prioritize enforcement actions where appropriate. It doesn't ban any specific new practices. More importantly, it tells agencies to consider issuing proposed regulations or consider promulgating regulations for voluntary country of origin labeling.
Let's parse that bureaucratic phrasing. Consider issuing proposed regulations means the president is telling an agency to think about drafting a rule that might be implemented someday in the future.
It's a suggestion to think about a rule.
Exactly. And the fact that the labeling would be voluntary means that even if the rule is eventually written, no company is legally forced to comply with it, and therefore there are no enforcement penalties for ignoring it.
So it's the illusion of structural change. It generates a fantastic headline the administration is cracking down on fake Made in America labels, which functions as a great symbolic victory for domestic manufacturers. But mechanically, it lacks the teeth to instantly alter the behavior of deceptive online sellers. It is a suggestion disguised as a mandate.
To truly appreciate how unorthodox these documents are, it really helps to look at the one piece of routine, traditional government functioning included in our stack. There is a brief mention of the signing of Senate Bill 400-138.
Right, S-4138, which is a bill waiving a 60-day notice requirement to allow for the posthumous honorary promotion of an Army captain named Cody Cork. It's just a single sentence. It is a quiet, uncontroversial, entirely necessary administrative function of the executive branch recognizing a service member. Seeing that single line of normal bureaucratic operation really highlights just how loud, legally precarious, and culturally aggressive the rest of these orders are.
Because as we move from the symbolic maneuvering of college football and product labeling to the global stage, the scale of executive ambition becomes staggering. Let's examine the administration's vision for the future of industry, technology, and energy. We are looking at a document outlining the National AI Legislative Framework and a massive fact sheet detailing the U.S.-Japan alliance.
The AI framework outlines 6 pillars, and the overarching theme is undeniable: American AI dominance. The administration wants to remove barriers to innovation, protect intellectual property, and develop an AI-ready workforce. But the physical, mechanical demands of this framework are where the story gets really interesting.
Right.
The document explicitly states that ratepayers should not foot the bill for data centers, and it demands that Congress streamline permitting so that data centers can generate power on site. Why is the White House suddenly so concerned about how a data center gets its electricity?
Because the physical footprint of artificial intelligence is incomprehensibly massive. When you ask a generative AI model to write an email or generate an image, it requires thousands of highly advanced graphic processing units, or GPUs, to calculate the response. These servers run incredibly hot. They require massive amounts of electricity just to operate, and millions of gallons of water to cool the facilities. A single, large-scale AI data center can consume as much electricity as a medium-sized American city.
So if a company like Microsoft or OpenAI builds one of these massive data centers in a suburban county and they just plug it directly into the local public utility grid, the strain is enormous. The utility company has to build new transmission lines and buy more power, and they pass those costs directly onto the regular citizens in that county. Suddenly, your monthly electric bill doubles, so a tech giant can train its next language model.
And the administration understands that if residential power bills skyrocket to fund AI development, the political backlash from voters will be severe. The solution proposed in the framework is to have these tech giants bypass the public grid entirely by generating their own massive amounts of power on site.
But how do you generate city levels of power in the backyard of a data center? Windmills and solar panels aren't going to cut it for that kind of baseline demand. The answer is actually in the U.S.-Japan alliance fact sheet. This document details a second tranche of massive Japanese investments into the United States. It highlights up to $40 billion from GE Vernova Hitachi to build small modular reactor power plants and up to $33 billion in natural gas generation facilities.
So we really need to explain what a small modular reactor, or SMR, actually is. Because when we think of nuclear power, we picture the massive concrete cooling towers of a traditional plant, which take decades and billions of dollars to build. SMRs are a newer technology. They are much smaller, advanced nuclear reactors that can be manufactured in a factory, shipped on a truck, and assembled on site. They are designed to be exactly the kind of dedicated, massive power source an AI data center would need.
Okay, so we have $40 billion in foreign investment for nuclear reactors, and the AI framework demanding that data centers generate their own power. But building a nuclear reactor, even a small one, usually requires years of intense environmental and safety reviews by local and federal regulators. How do they bypass that red tape to build these fast enough for the tech companies?
You have to look at the quietest executive order in our stack, the adjusting certain delegations under the Defense Production Act.
The Defense Production Act is a Cold War-era law, right?
Yeah.
It was designed to let the president force private industries to prioritize national security needs.
Right.
Like we saw it used during the pandemic to force companies to manufacture ventilators.
Exactly. And this new executive order is incredibly brief. It simply amends a 2012 EO to add the Secretary of Energy alongside the Secretary of Commerce, granting the Energy Secretary independent emergency powers under the Defense Production Act.
Oh, wow. When you connect those dots, the picture is just breathtaking. The administration is using the Defense Production Act, a national security emergency power, to elevate the Energy Secretary. This allows the federal government to bypass local zoning boards and environmental reviews to fast-track the permitting of private nuclear reactors and natural gas plants, funded by $70 billion from Japan, built specifically to power the data centers of trillion-dollar American tech giants.
Yes.
It's a massive, coordinated structural restructuring of the American energy grid to benefit big tech and the nuclear industry, all under the banner of national security and AI dominance.
It is the ultimate VIP fast pass for the technology sector. And the administration's protection of these tech companies extends beyond just giving them private power plants. It extends to the very code they write. Let's look at the preventing censorship pillar within that AI framework.
Yeah, the document states that AI systems must be prevented from, quote, being used to silence or censor lawful political expression or dissent, and that AI cannot become a vehicle to dictate right and wrong think. On the surface, protecting free speech is a core American value. But how does an AI actually censor someone?
To understand this, we have to look at how AI safety guardrails are engineered. When a company like OpenAI trains a model, the raw model is capable of generating almost anything, including highly detailed instructions on how to build a bomb, incredibly convincing deepfake audio of political candidates, or massive volumes of racial slurs. To prevent the AI from generating this harmful content, engineers use a process called reinforcement learning from human feedback to build invisible fences or filters around the AI.
Right, so if you ask it to generate a racist joke, the filter triggers, and the AI replies, I cannot fulfill that request.
Exactly. But the administration's framework is framing those engineering safety filters as censorship.
Wait, really? So if this framework were enacted into law, it would legally bind AI companies to allow all, quote, lawful political expression. But in the United States, under the First Amendment, almost all speech is lawful, unless it is a direct incitement to immediate violence or constitutes defamation. Therefore, extreme political propaganda, highly coordinated disinformation campaigns, and sophisticated deepfakes of public officials are all technically lawful political expression.
They are. So by mandating that AI cannot censor lawful speech, the government is essentially demanding that tech companies strip away the safety filters that prevent their products from becoming automated propaganda machines. They are ensuring the AI can be utilized as a tool for unrestricted political warfare.
This deep integration of government ambition and corporate power is fully realized in another event mentioned in the sources. First Lady Melania Trump's Fostering the Future Together summit. The press release details a gathering of leaders from 45 nations and 28 tech entities. It explicitly names companies like OpenAI, Microsoft, xAI, Meta, and Palantir, bringing them right into the White House and the State Department.
This represents a profound shift in how American diplomacy operates. The administration isn't just regulating these companies, it is deeply intertwining American diplomatic power with private, for-profit AI corporations. By bringing Meta and OpenAI to the table with 45 sovereign nations under the official banner of U.S. statecraft, the administration is effectively deputizing these tech giants as extensions of American geopolitical power.
It's a unified front. The government clears the regulations, secures the foreign investment for the nuclear power, and mandates the removal of speech filters, while the corporations build the dominant technology.
It is a grand, sweeping vision for the future of global power. But that highly coordinated, strategic vision contrasts incredibly sharply with the day-to-day reality of how this administration communicates with the public. To understand that, we have to look at our final segment, the messaging war.
We're looking at a massive volume of official press releases, the daily emails and memos that get pumped out to the White House press corps and published on government websites. At the time these documents were generated, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, had been shut down for 35 days. Over 100,000 employees, including 50,000 TSA officers, are working without pay.
And the human toll of a shutdown is severe. The administration's press releases highlight this real pain extensively. They cite multi-hour security lines at airports in Atlanta and Houston. They share stories of unpaid Border Patrol agents struggling to buy groceries. And they publish letters from airline CEOs begging for a resolution to the crisis.
But the mechanics of a government shutdown require a failure of negotiation across multiple branches. Congress has to pass an appropriations bill, and the president has to sign it. If the House, the Senate, and the executive branch can't agree on what to fund, the money stops flowing. It is, by definition, a shared failure of governance.
Yet, when you read these official White House press releases, there is absolutely zero acknowledgement of shared responsibility. The official organs of the state are used exclusively to frame the opposition in uncompromising, absolutist terms. The documents state that the shutdown is 100% the fault of, quote, radical left Democrats.
The vocabulary is brutal. The press releases claim Democrats are pushing unserious extreme demands to reinstitute Biden's failed open border agenda and protect criminal illegal aliens. The official documents claim the opposition party is very serene about making the American people hurt and explicitly labels them defund the police Democrats.
It is taking the real, visceral pain of angry travelers and unpaid workers and using it as a pure, unfiltered political bludgeon. It frames a complex legislative disagreement over funding levels and border policy as a binary struggle between an administration trying to protect the country and an opposition party that supposedly prioritizes violent criminals over its own citizens.
And we see this exact same absolutist framing applied not just to domestic funding, but to international warfare. Let's look at the press releases for Operation Epic Fury. This is described as a major lethal military campaign against the regime in Iran. The White House documents tout overwhelming, devastating success and the total obliteration of the enemy's capabilities.
Now, evaluating the success of a military operation usually involves analyzing strategic objectives, casualty reports, and geopolitical stability. But how does this White House prove the success of Operation Epic Fury to the public? They quote polling numbers.
That blew my mind. The official press release cites polls from the Vandenberg Coalition, NBC News, and CNN. But they don't just cite general approval. They specifically highlight that 90% of NAGA Republicans and 80% of Republicans overall support the military operation.
This is a highly concerning use of the military public relations apparatus. The White House is distributing the polling data of its own specific partisan political base to validate the success of an ongoing, lethal military campaign. It fundamentally conflates domestic political popularity among supporters with tactical, real-world military victory.
And the administration's aggressive posture extends directly to the media outlets reporting on these military actions. There was a specific press release dedicated entirely to attacking CNN. The network apparently reported that the U.S. military did not adequately plan for the possibility of Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, which is a crucial global shipping lane, in retaliation.
And instead of issuing a factual rebuttal from the Pentagon detailing their strategic preparations, the White House release calls CNN journalists hacks peddling Democrat-sourced fiction. The official document then quotes Republican senators who call the CNN report a flat-out lie.
The administration is using official, taxpayer-funded government channels the permanent record of the executive branch to wage a targeted, partisan war against a specific media outlet over the narrative of a military campaign.
We also see them utilizing friendly media to bolster their narrative. The stack includes an op-ed from the Wall Street Journal by Kimberly Strassel titled Trump's Energy Triumph, which was distributed through official White House email lists.
And the piece attacks the, quote, Democratic media complex and praises the administration's energy policies, specifically the shale revolution and the Abraham Accords. Just to provide context, the Abraham Accords were a series of treaties normalizing diplomatic relations between Israel and several Arab states, negotiated during the first Trump administration. The op-ed argues that these accords, combined with high domestic oil production, insulate the United States from economic shocks in the Middle East during conflicts like Operation Epic Fury.
By blasting this op-ed out through official channels, the administration is laundering an opinion piece as official state validation.
You really have to wonder what this does to a citizen trying to stay informed. When an official government document states as an unquestionable fact that a domestic crisis is entirely the fault of a rival party who loves criminals, or tells you a military operation has unstoppable momentum because MAGI-A voters approve of it, or uses the presidential seal to attack reporters as hacks, how do you extract the truth? It feels exactly like trying to learn about complex human nutrition by only reading the back of a brightly colored cereal box. The box will tell you it's part of a complete breakfast and packed with vitamins, but it will never mention the 40 grams of sugar. You're only consuming the marketing.
The cereal box analogy captures the exact mechanism at play here. When the highest office in the land uses its official, permanent press apparatus to exclusively attack domestic political opponents and wage war on the press, it fundamentally alters the relationship between the government and the governed. The government ceases to be an arbiter of official record. It erodes the baseline of shared facts, turning the executive branch into a permanent 24/7 campaign war room.
Which brings us to the end of this massive stack of documents. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, analyzing the mechanics of power. We've seen executive action used to rewrite the rules of the housing market, lowering the safety bar for massive regional banks, and stripping environmental codes for real estate developers, while quietly shifting long-term financial and physical risks onto the everyday homebuyer.
We have watched the power of the purse be weaponized against state governments over the social safety net, using unprecedented campaign-style rhetoric about gangs and election fraud to threaten the funding of healthcare and food assistance.
We've explored the surreal, constitutionally precarious attempts to use the FCC to dictate the broadcast schedules of college sports networks in the name of cultural signaling, and contrasted that with the toothless voluntary language of the Made in America labeling efforts.
We've mapped out the breathtaking, coordinated effort to shape the geopolitical future of artificial intelligence, utilizing emergency national security powers to bypass local regulations, funneling billions in foreign investment into private nuclear reactors for tech giants, and mandating the removal of critical safety filters on the AI itself.
And finally, we unpacked the aggressive, uncompromising public relations war waged against political rivals and the press, where the suffering of unpaid government workers and the lethal reality of military operations are reduced to partisan polling metrics and blunt political attacks.
It is a lot to process, but as you navigate the news going forward, we want to leave you with a final concept to consider regarding the very nature of executive power. Think about how the definition of an executive order has shifted over time.
Originally, an executive order was designed as a relatively mundane, highly bureaucratic tool. It was meant for the chief executive to manage the internal operations of the federal workforce. It was essentially the CEO of the government sending an instructional memo to the various department heads.
But looking at the mechanics of these 2026 documents, the executive order has evolved into something entirely different. It has become a mechanism for immediate, heavy-handed cultural signaling. It is utilized as a blunt instrument to bypass the slow, frustrating, compromise-driven grind of Congress. And perhaps most significantly, it has been transformed into a permanent, official billboard for partisan political campaigning.
As you watch the news and you see the headline that a sweeping new executive order has just been signed, try to look past the bold print. Ask yourself not just what that piece of paper commands the bureaucracy to do, but who the true intended audience for that piece of paper really is, who benefits immediately, who pays the price decades from now, and what mechanisms are quietly turning in the background. Because often the most important part of the machine is the part they aren't pointing at. Keep your investigative lenses handy.